Hey Cardano, the topic of this video will be centered around a single question. Do you know how TradFi works? When you trade on the stock market through a broker like Fidelity, do you know how Fidelity works? I'm not asking if you're an expert on the subject. I'm definitely not an expert. But when you place a trade, do you have a general idea what happens under the hood? I get the sense that most people don't. Unfortunately, this includes the DeFi DApp developers themselves. I could be wrong, but it seems to me like most people have interacted with brokers like Coinbase and Fidelity, and because of that, they think they know how DeFi should be built. But your experience is likely that of an end user. So much happens behind the scenes to create the experience you are used to in TradFi. If you don't know what happens behind the scenes, then you really need to watch this video all the way through. You can't understand something from just a piece of it. You need to see the full picture. If you don't understand TradFi, how could you possibly know how to build out DeFi? Would you even be able to distinguish between properly designed apps and badly designed ones? I don't think so. This lack of understanding only creates a vicious cycle. DApp developers don't actually know how TradFi markets work, so the dApps they build are fundamentally flawed. Flawed dApps don't create real economic activity, so the DeFi economy doesn't develop. The community then gets frustrated with the lack of DeFi adoption and demand DApp developers build more. This cycle is a waste of time and money. Currently, only about 1.5% of Cardano's value is participating in DeFi. You can calculate this yourself by dividing Cardano's current TVL by its market cap. The other 98.5% is waiting on the sidelines. I think they are waiting for Cardano to finally break out of this vicious cycle. One thing in particular tipped me off to the idea that people probably don't understand TradFi. I'm calling it the quest for the Holy Grail DApp. The Holy Grail DApp has all of the useful features built right into it. If you don't understand how TradFi works, then this next statement will sound absurd to you. Most features should not be directly built into the DApp. As I'll explain in this video, the Holy Grail DApp approach is doomed to fail. TradFi has all of the fancy features people want, but it supports them using a layered approach. The idea is actually very similar to what Cardano is trying to do with a barebones layer 1 and fancy layer 2s built on top. Let's jump right into the example of stock trading. Imagine there's an exchange broker with some users. Let's call that broker Fidelity. If Alice creates a limit order through Fidelity, Fidelity will first try to match that limit order internally. For example, perhaps Bob created a limit order that complements Alice's. Fidelity will just match the two orders from its own users. But what if none of Fidelity's other users created a complementary order? What now? Well, Fidelity isn't the only broker in town. Perhaps another broker has orders it can match with. But who matches orders across brokers? To ask this another way, who is the broker for brokers? TradFi doesn't use blockchains yet, so it's not a blockchain. Have you ever thought about this? If you think the answer is the stock exchange, you would be incorrect. The answer is actually a private United States company called the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, or the DTCC for short. Even though it is a US company, it actually handles settlement for most of the world's capital markets. It doesn't just do stock trading. It also handles corporate and municipal bonds, trusts, mortgage-backed securities, and even some transactions between large entities like mutual funds. According to Wikipedia, in 2011, the DTCC settled $1.7 quadrillion worth of activity. Despite how systemically important the DTCC is, most end users have never even heard of it. As an end user, you never interact with the DTCC directly. You always go through brokers. At a high level, this is TradFi. As I said, TradFi's structure is very similar to the layered approach Cardano is after. Do you see it? Let me make it explicit. The DTCC is layer 1 for TradFi markets. The brokers are layer 2 entities. End users interact with markets through these layer 2 entities. This organization has an interesting property. Features that exist in layer 2 entities don't need to exist on layer 1. There are 3 examples I want to talk about: settlement time, liquidity, and best price enforcement. The latter 2 examples are common demands for features directly supported in DeFi dexes. Let's start with settlement. The DTCC actually takes 2 days to settle a trade. This is known as the T+2 rule. But as an end user, buying a stock on a broker like Fidelity looks like it goes through immediately. Brokers are able to pretend that the trade settles immediately because the chances of the transaction getting reversed within the 2 days is extremely small. Cardano's Ouroboros Peros is based on the same general principle. The brokers are willing to take on this minor risk to provide instant settlement for their end users. So layer 1 does not have instant settlement, but layer 2 does. End users are able to enjoy that instant settlement by using the layer 2 entities instead of the layer 1 directly. Okay, next example. Where do market makers fall into this structure? Do they exist as part of the DTCC on layer 1, or are they actually another layer 2 entity? The answer is the latter. Market makers are a layer 2 entity. The DTCC actually doesn't provide liquidity for the market. Its job is purely settlement. Separate businesses are set up as layer 2 entities to provide any necessary liquidity. I want to point out that this highlights that layer 2 entities can work together. Brokers need market makers to provide liquidity, and market makers need brokers to supply demand, aka users, for that liquidity. The layer 2 entities act synergistically. Final example. TradFi enforces National Best Bid and Offer, or NBBO for short, meaning if you place a limit order, your order will get filled at the best possible price, even if that price is above your limit price. This feature is a common talking point among DEX developers and community members. Understandably so, since it is a very nice feature. Where do you think this enforcement takes place? Does it take place on layer 1 or layer 2? It takes place on layer 2. If you look up the NBBO wording, it only applies to brokers, which are layer 2 entities. If Fidelity is caught not following the NBBO rules, it is Fidelity that gets in trouble, not the DTCC. Again, the DTCC is only settlement. In TradFi, layer 1 does not have best price enforcement. That feature only exists on layer 2, and users are able to enjoy this feature by using the layer 2 entities instead of the layer 1 directly. Now that we have that background, let's look at the Holy Grail DEX. As you can see, the Holy Grail DEX flattens the layered TradFi organization into a single application that services all users and businesses. It tries to be a single DApp that has everything: liquidity, massive throughput, cheap transactions, censorship resistance, and decentralization. It is the perfect DApp. As far as I can tell, this is what the community and DApp developers currently seem to be after. Unfortunately, just like the Holy Grail, this DApp is not real. It is a myth. Just look at the features. Some of them are fundamentally at odds with each other. How can you have massive throughput while still being secure and decentralized? The blockchain trilemma says this isn't possible. Slight tangent, some projects claim to have solved the blockchain trilemma, but digging deeper, they haven't. Both reading from and writing to the blockchain need to be decentralized. It is great if an order book can process millions of transactions per second in a decentralized manner. But how do you look up the current order book? If viewing the order book requires going through a centralized entity, does it matter that updating the order book is decentralized? No, it doesn't. The centralized entity can abuse its power by just not showing you the current order book. A project is only as decentralized as its most centralized point. Every time I've looked at these projects, they've improved the writing side at the expense of the reading side. They have all said something like, reading from the blockchain is more difficult now, but that problem is out of scope for the current phase. We will look into that at a later point. Please keep this in mind the next time you see a project claim to have solved the blockchain trilemma. Odds are they aren't telling you the full story. Back to the Holy Grail. If you try to create a DApp that has it all, you will unfortunately fail. One product cannot satisfy all possible use cases because it actually isn't possible. It is like the quote, if you try to please everyone, you will end up pleasing no one. What you actually do create will be a Frankenstein DApp that is extremely fragile. Since this DApp is the market, if it goes down, even temporarily, the DeFi economy would grind to a halt until it can be brought back online. The DeFi economy must have 100% uptime. It is okay for some features to go down temporarily, but the basic market functionality must never go down. This is non-negotiable. The layering approach evolved naturally over TradFi's thousands of years of market experiments. This is for two reasons. This approach is anti-fragile, and it enables increased efficiency for the overall system. Consider the actual demands on each layer. Layer 1 is just bare bones features. As the DTCC shows, it doesn't need to be fast. Layer 2 has separate entities that specialize in providing extra features. Because the layer 1 is kept simple, it is extremely stable. It never goes down. Extra risk is pushed into layer 2 entities. If these layer 2 entities collapse, the rest of the market can keep going because the layer 1 didn't go down with it. To give a concrete example, if a market making business goes bust, the market can keep going with a bit less liquidity for end users until a new market maker steps in to fill the void. Think of it like how spaceships are designed. Spaceships try to provide a comfortable living experience for astronauts on board. But when things go bad, only life support is prioritized. That comfortable room temperature you are used to is sacrificed for more critical things like making sure oxygen is available. Things will stay like this until the spaceship is fixed. But hey, at least the astronauts are still alive. As long as they are alive, they can fix the ship. Layer 1 is meant to be life support for the market. It is supposed to only have the bare minimum needed to keep the market functioning in emergencies. Quality of life features are not needed in emergencies, so they are relegated to a separate layer. So unlike the Holy Grail DApp, the layering approach has a built-in life support system to fall back on in emergencies. As for efficiency, I explained in my paradigm shift video that specialized entities working together create synergy that enables the system to become more efficient overall. By having a rock-solid foundation to build off of, the Layer 2 entities can specialize and work together to compensate for the features lacking in Layer 1. TradFi does have problems. I definitely don't mean to say TradFi is perfect. Blockchains wouldn't exist right now if it didn't have problems. But the problem with TradFi is not the layering architecture. The problem is that TradFi is currently limiting how the layers operate and how end users can interact with the system. To see how, let's first look at liquid democracy. As this slide shows, liquid democracy has the same layered organization as the DTCC model. Layer 1 is the proposal itself and its votes. All Layer 1 does is record and tally the votes. Layer 2 entities are delegated representatives. End users don't always have the time to review every proposal, so the rational thing to do is delegate to someone whose judgment you trust. But this approach centralizes voting power. How does liquid democracy keep a check on abuse of this power? It does so through two features. Becoming a DREP is cheap and permissionless. This creates ample competition among DREPs and helps prevent collusion among the DREPs. But if the extreme case happens and all DREPs actually do collude, users can always vote on proposals directly. Both features are required to keep centralized power in check. But these two checks on centralized power are not unique to liquid democracy. They work on any system that is organized like this. To rephrase these points to be more general, creating a new Layer 2 entity must be a cheap and permissionless process, and it must be possible for users to permissionlessly interact with the Layer 1 directly. The word permissionless should jump out at you. Let's go back to the DTCC model. Starting a new broker business is very costly due to all of the regulations around it. These regulations effectively make creating a Layer 2 entity a permissioned process. This results in only a few brokers existing at a given time. So if Charlie doesn't trust Fidelity anymore, his only option is to switch to Ameritrade. But what if Ameritrade was also abusing its users? Could Charlie interact with the DTCC directly? No, he can't. The DTCC does not allow end users to interact with it directly. End users must go through brokers. That means there is nothing Charlie can do except drop out of the market. Since this is usually too costly of a sacrifice, Charlie's only hope is that regulators step in to stop the abuse by brokers. But this assumes the regulators themselves are honest. And even if they are, it could still take years for regulators to act. In the meantime, Charlie is not given fair access to the market. TradFi is currently missing the two key features that keep centralized power in check. Instead of trying to build the Holy Grail DApp, DApp developers should look for this organizational pattern in TradFi and replace as much of it as possible with blockchain. Liquid democracy is an improvement over representative democracy precisely because it does this. This layering pattern can be found all over TradFi. The banking system is another example. Once you find an example of this pattern, pretty much every Layer 1 should be a decentralized DApp. I actually can't think of a situation where this isn't true. The Layer 1 must be fully decentralized for the checks on power to work. This is non-negotiable. Also, the Layer 1 DApp should only have bare bones features for the market since it is only meant to be a rock-solid foundation to build Layer 2 entities on. If the extreme case happens and all Layer 2 entities collapse, the Layer 1 DApp can act as life support for the DeFi economy until new Layer 2 entities are created. For Layer 2 entities, they can either be businesses or blockchain Layer 2s like Midgard and Hydra. Slight side note, I'm actually curious about the idea of specialized L2s being built on top of a Layer 1 DApp. For example, there could be a blockchain L2 solely dedicated to high-frequency trading. All of the current blockchain L2s are trying to be general purpose. This is just a thought right now. But anyway, just like in TradFi, market making and best price enforcement should be left to these Layer 2 entities. Despite how important end users seem to think these features are, from a market perspective, these are wants, not needs. A market can function without them until new Layer 2 entities are created. As it is, Best price enforcement only came into effect in 2005, yet markets existed for a long time prior to that. If you try to add them directly to layer 1, you will just destabilize it. And since layer 1 is the foundation for the whole system, it will destabilize the whole system. Layer 1 needs to prioritize stability over feature richness due to how much is going to be built on top. As long as the layer 1 is actually decentralized, creating layer 2 entities is permissionless. And also because the layer 1 is decentralized, end users can choose to forego the nice features of the layer 2 entities and interact with the layer 1 directly. As a result, DeFi would have the same checks on the abuse of power as liquid democracy while retaining the anti-fragility, efficiency, and feature richness from TradFi. This is how I think DeFi should be built. You might be wondering what the difference is between the DTCC and the stock exchange. The difference is settlement versus indexing. When a trade is actually executed, balances need to be updated to reflect the trade. This is the job of the DTCC. But if Alice creates a limit order on Fidelity, how do the other brokers hear about the new open order? Brokers each show the current order book, so they all need to hear about orders created through other brokers. This is the job of the stock exchange. The stock exchange broadcasts all current orders to everyone, so brokers all see the same order book. The stock exchange doesn't care about account balances. It only cares about the current open orders. Even though TradFi separates settlement from indexing, I don't think DeFi should. As I've been trying to stress, not only should the layer 1 be a rock-solid foundation to build layer 2 entities on, but it must also act as life support in emergencies. Both settlement and indexing are required for markets to function properly, so it is better to merge them into the DeFi layer 1. This effectively means the layer 1 requires posting open orders directly on-chain. To put it another way, it requires using on-chain intents. Since this requires a transaction fee, the layer 1 will not be able to support day trading and high-frequency trading since the transaction fees make them too expensive. However, a layer 2 entity can be created to augment this limitation. This is what I was getting at when I mentioned a dedicated layer 2 that specializes in high-frequency trading. In order to gain the high throughput necessary for high-frequency trading, some censorship resistance will need to be sacrificed in order to support off-chain intents. But since users can interact with the layer 1 directly if they wish, users that care more about censorship resistance will prefer using the layer 1 directly. Examples include trillion-dollar corporations like Apple and Microsoft, and even central banks. High net worth individuals may also prefer using the layer 1 directly. Then, users that prefer throughput and cheap fees can use the layer 2 entities with their off-chain intents. So what I'm arguing for is a hybrid approach. Layer 1 will have on-chain intents, and layer 2 entities can either use the layer 1's on-chain intents or their own off-chain intents that interact with the on-chain intents. I actually like the nested transaction SIP because it makes this hybrid approach very easy. There are some nuances with this hybrid approach, like how does liquidity work if it is split between on-chain and off-chain intents, but I think that is a whole other rabbit hole to go down, and I would rather make a separate video for that. Anyway, I would like to hear your thoughts on this layered approach. Do you disagree with anything said in this video? Let me know in a comment below or on X. Building DeFi needs to be a collaborative effort.